Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll be getting started in a few moments. Hello, as you come in, thank you. Hello, welcome. We'll be getting started in a few moments. Before we start, if everyone would like to introduce themselves in the chat, that would be great. Your name and title and where you are from. Thank you. Welcome to those who are just joining us. We are about to start in a moment. Those that are with us, if you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, you are welcome to do so. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Sean Guy, Director of Programs and Operations for the Conference on Crimes Against Women. Let's get started with a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout today's presentation. Questions will be answered throughout the presentation, so please feel free to use the Q&A box. If you'd like to make comments or interact with the speakers and fellow attendees, be sure to select the All Panelists and Attendees option at the bottom of your chat box so everyone can see what you have written. If you have any technical difficulties, in that instance, you'll select only the All Panelists option and an ICCR staff member will assist you. Before we begin, a little background on the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. Created in 2018 as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women, ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative, systemic responses to domestic violence. ICCR works to accomplish this mission in two ways. One, by saturating the state of Texas with effective criminal justice system responses to domestic violence. And secondly, by ensuring every community across the United States, no matter how small, receives the training they need to provide justice for victims and hold offenders accountable. Each year through our yearly cohort, ICCR works with up to 4 teams made up of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and advocates from rural Texas counties to take a deep dive into their current criminal justice system responses to domestic violence and begin building the scaffolding for a sustainable ICCR. The cohort year is completely free for selected applicants and includes an institutional analysis, free in-person trainings, and hands-on CCR support. Applications for the 2023 cohort are now open. In addition, ICCR's virtual trainings, like today's webinar, allows us to reach communities anywhere in the country. In all of our trainings, we work to center the unique needs and strengths of rural communities while providing practical skills and tools that can be immediately implemented. Although our trainings are geared towards rural needs, our trainings are relevant to any practitioners who are committed to eradicating domestic violence. So thank you for being here today and for your dedication to improving your own community's domestic violence response. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, www.instituteccr.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to stay in the loop about all the great trainings we provide throughout the year. Our next free training will be Thursday, September 8th, entitled Hand in Hand, Law Enforcement Serving in Order to Protect. And I thought there was another slide in here about our other upcoming, we have a rural advocacy call that's coming up on September 28th. We have another monthly webinar on September 8th. And then we have the rural conference, which is October 3rd and 4th. So somehow that slide got lost, but you can find out all that information on the website. And now to our speakers. Misty Biddick is currently the Executive Director of AWARE Central Texas. Previously, Ms. Biddick served 8 years in the U.S. Army, and before then was the Family Violence Specialized Caseload Officer for Bell, Lampasas County's Community Supervision and Corrections Department. Ms. Biddick established the first family violence specialized caseload in Bell County and is considered an expert regarding the subjects of victimology, family violence offender interventions, and intimate partner strangulation. She is an executive committee member of the Texas Victims Assistance Association, sits on the Office of the Texas Attorney General's Human Trafficking Prevention Task Force, and is the current chair of the Central Texas Family Violence Task Force and the Central Texas Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking Roundtable. Jerry Meadors is currently the Jerry Meadors is currently the Chief of Police for the Rockdale Police Department located in rural Central Texas. Chief Meadors is a 26-year veteran of law enforcement, the majority of his career investigating domestic violence, sexual assault, and child sexual exploitation crimes. He has served as an investigator for municipal, county, and state law enforcement. Chief Meadors previously served with Office of the Attorney General for the state of Texas as the commander of the Southern Texas Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, while supervising the child exploitation, human trafficking, digital forensics, and fugitive apprehension units. He also currently serves in the law enforcement working group for the Governor's Sexual Assault Survivors Task Force. That is a mouthful. Okay, so Misty and Jerry, please take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerry Meadors, and as Sean just told you, that I'm the Chief of Police for Rockdale Police Department. Misty, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Misty Biddick again. I'm the Executive Director of Aware Central Texas. We're a dual sexual assault domestic violence center here located in Killeen outside the gates of Fort Hood. We're really excited to be here today. And we're going to kind of do things a little bit differently. We're not going to have a PowerPoint presentation. We want to have a conversation with you. We're going to talk with you about what our ICCR process looked like. And we want to hear from you because I can't tell you how many of these trainings I've went to where I haven't had my questions answered. And so we really want to take this time and get the information to you that you really want. I'm going to throw it back at you, Jerry.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. When Misty and I were talking about putting this thing together, our main priority was to be able to be somewhat of a resource to those of you who may find yourself in a similar situation that I found myself in when I began this process, and some trials and errors that came along the way. But just wanted to be a resource to you all. And so thank you, number one, for being here and taking an interest in this and trying to improve your communities. It makes a bigger difference than you will ever know. And please feel free to, however they do it on here, raise your hand or write in the chat box, or if you have any questions at all or want us to clarify on something or repeat something, you're not bothering us at all. We encourage that interaction with us as much as possible. So if you have a question, just type it in, and one of the moderators here will bring it to our attention, and we'll try to address it for you. And with that, we'll get started. So I took over as chief of police here in Rockdale, Texas, in June of 2020. And Rockdale is a small community, a rural community, a population just under 6,000. And we're located about 40 miles south of Waco, about 25 miles kind of northwest of College Station, and about 40 miles east of Austin. So right in that area there. Very rural county. I think the total county population here in Milam County is about 25,000, maybe a little bit more. It's primarily ranch and farmland here in Milam County. And becoming the chief of police here, I noticed that my officers were responding to primarily domestic violence calls, a lot of domestic calls during the day. And my agency is only an 11-man or 11-person agency, sworn officers. That's counting me down. And so during the day shift, I may only have one or maybe two officers on at a time, counting myself. We are also the 911 PSAP for the southern half of the county. So I have a dispatch here that runs all 911 calls for fire and EMS as well. But I noticed primarily, the majority of our calls were domestic cases, and my officers responded to 2, 3, sometimes 4 of these a day. In addition to other calls, barking dogs or whatever else we get. As we all know, that domestic violence cases or calls for law enforcement are some of the most dangerous calls that we as law enforcement can go to. And some of the most dangerous situations that you as victims advocates could be in as well if y'all respond to the location or around the actor or somewhere around. So that concerned me that my officers were going to that many calls, and the majority of the calls were repeat locations. It got to where within the first few weeks of me being here, I already knew names, and we'd already been at the same residence 2 or 3 times within a 2-week period. Sometimes we could make arrests, sometimes we couldn't. There was no actual offense that occurred. I found that during this process that my officers were not documenting. In most cases, when an arrest wasn't made or an actual offense didn't occur, there was no documentation to go along with why we had been called there, other than just a general call slip. So my number one concern was my officer safety, the strain on my resources, what little I had as far as law enforcement to answer other calls, and quality of life for the survivors of these calls that we did go to. When they're, we arrest the perpetrator and they're back out of jail in a day or two, and we're right back there with the victim again, for the survivor again, for whatever reason. And there could be a whole host of reasons for that. So I began looking at my community. What are we doing to serve these victims? Why, number one, are we going back to these same calls over and over and over again to the same location? Why are the survivors allowing the perpetrator back into their life again after we've arrested them and removed them from the situation? Why are they back in the home again? And so I had to educate myself a little bit on that, even having worked these cases for the majority of my career. That's as a law enforcement officer, that's always kind of been in the back of my mind. Why did they allow them back in the home? And so this process was quite educating for me. I started looking at what resources were available to us and to the survivors in Milam County. And much like many rural counties, we have no community-based victims advocacy groups in Milam County. We have one victim services coordinator that is housed with the DA's office, the district attorney's office there in Cameron. And that's it. That's all we have. We don't have mental facilities in this county. We don't have really any resources for victims at all. Our one victim services coordinator that we do have, if you can imagine, my agency is going to 2 or 3 of these a day. And so is every other law enforcement agency in the county. That poor woman in that position at the DA's office, it quickly becomes overwhelmed. And on top of that, normally the district attorney's victims advocate doesn't even receive the information that there was ever even a call until we've made an arrest or we forwarded a case to the DA's office for prosecutions. You know, we as law enforcement know that sometimes that's days or even weeks after we make the call and the report, the initial investigation is done, and they go to CID for follow-up. And that's way too long, in my opinion, for a survivor or the family to receive information and resources to start the healing process and to provide them with options. And that's really what I wanted to do is through this process was to link my survivors with services to provide them with options for removing themselves from the situation, for finding another place to live, for counseling, any other option other than, okay, this guy's gone to jail. Now what? How do I pay bills? How do I get to work? Do I even have a job? Do they even have a car? Do they have access to their bank accounts? Or does this guy control everything? And we were finding in most cases that they do. A lot of our victims are unemployed. They're staying at home mothers. Their abusers have done the typical thing of making it to where they are the sole source provider for anything that this victim needs. And that's by design. We know that as law enforcement, that's by design. It was no difference here. And so really just wanted to provide my community with resources. Some other option other than depending on the same person over and over and over again to make sure that they have food on the table in the house over their head. So with that, and I can't remember exactly if I received just an email through the CACA, through the Crimes Against Women Conference annual email or emails they send out or what, or if I found it in a Google search. But I was actively searching for information on how to address this situation. And it came across the ICCR group and signed up for that program. And normally, as I said before, that involves a local law enforcement, a prosecutor, somebody from prosecutor's office, a victim's advocate, systems based, and preferably a community based victim's advocate as well. Now, in that process, I quickly understood that not only was my small agency, our resources were strained, but also the DA's office as well. And so initially they were on board with the process, and at some point they fell out pretty soon in the process and really didn't participate a whole lot in it, which left it back to me again. But, hey, we're finally getting rain here. Sorry if I can hear that thunder outside. It's a beautiful sound. Hope it heads your way, Misty. So being in a rural community, you can only do what you can do. And the DA's office can only do what they can do. And they couldn't join the process for whatever reason. But I was dedicated to this process and dedicated to my survivors and my community that I was going to push through anyway, to whatever end. I didn't know what that looked like. But through the ICCR group, the Institute, they had connections with Misty Biddick and her group of Aware Central Texas. And she'll speak more on her group here when she chimes in here in just a minute. But I found out that they are a community-based advocacy group that based out of Bell County that does service the Milam County area as well. but nobody here knew about it. I mean, maybe my DA's coordinator knew about it, but they didn't share the information with me at all. And so Misty was quick to jump on board, and really through this process, it caused me to take a deeper look at our procedures and how we deal with domestic violence, how we, the quality of our investigations, our documentation of that, because that's so important. You know, we as law enforcement, we don't do our job on the front end of it, and we don't get a conviction on the hind end of it, or at least a good plea deal because of the work we put in, then we haven't really done our jobs. And documenting and clearly articulating the severity of the incidents and the injuries, fully completing our family violence forms, or in my agency's case, filling them out at all, and completing emergency protective orders, things like that. Providing survivors with information and options, as I said before, to remove themselves from this dangerous situation. When I first took over here, like I said, our policies and procedures were so out of date, and the practice of the officers here were very out of date. And it wasn't necessarily because of a lack of want to. It was honestly, it was a lack of education on the subject and what they should be doing, and lack of leadership. And when like I said, when I first took over here, that we weren't even doing emergency protective orders, weren't filling out family violence forms, certainly had not been filling out the strangulation supplement or even documenting those incidents. So once again, through the process, I identified some gaps in the service that we're providing our victims. We had no local-based community advocacy group. We have no women's shelter. No assistance whatsoever for immediate needs. If I needed to remove a victim or survivor and or children from a situation, physically remove them from my house to get them to a safer location, I had no resources to do it other than pay out of pocket. We have no funds set up here in my agency for that. There's no county funds set up for that. Like I said, the system-based advocacy out of the DA's office was not effective, and not necessarily because it's their fault. It's just the way the system is designed, that they're after the fact. They receive the information, we send over the prosecutor packet, and then they try to get involved. And a lot of times it requires survivors to initiate and pursue avenues of state-funded assistance on their own, if they ever did. We can hand out some paperwork there on scene, and then you know, it was kind of left up to the survivors to follow up on that. There was no one to walk them through the process, and that really disturbed me. There's no long-term survivor support to advise our survivors of this criminal justice process and what that looks like, what that means, counseling, peer support, any support for our victims. We're just kind of on their own. And so, like I said, through the ICCR process, we partnered up with Misty's group, and then we began to kind of look and see what that looked like. And I will tell you, those of us in law enforcement who have done this for a while, it's kind of hard to hand over the reins to someone else sometimes. And it would be hard for those of you who are looking at going through this process or looking at creating a partnership with an advocacy group with your agency. It's hard to do if you're not in the upper echelon of your chain of command. Really, it helps out a lot if your chief or assistant chief, or depending on how large your agency, your command staff buys into this. It makes it a lot easier. Because with law enforcement, there's a long history of us taking a case and this is ours, and we don't want to give out victim information or invite somebody else in that might muddy up the waters like an advocate. We almost see it as adversarial, and I will say, earlier in my career, I was guilty of that myself. I just didn't understand it, and I thought, well, we're the ones here to help. These other people are kind of stepping on our toes and getting in the way, and I've had some bad experiences with some advocates before that were overzealous, and no doubt they've had experience with law enforcement that was the same way.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right quick, Jerry. Okay, so
starting off from the very beginning of this process, I came in late to the game. Our advocates came in late. They were well on their way into this process when we got started, and we had some huge barriers that we had to overcome. Just initially, Bell County is situated. We're about 30 minutes from Milam County, but where our office is in Killeen, our response time is about an hour to Rockdale. So we had to overcome the fact that if we were going to respond, if we were going to provide services, they were going to be mobile services. It's going to be satellite advocacy. And not only that, but just trying to embed ourselves in the community. We had to overcome a lot of distrust and maybe just kind of wondering if we were really going to do what we said we were going to do. Not only with law enforcement, but with community members, because there had been nonprofits in the past that had come out there and said they were going to do this, this, and this, and then failed to, come through on their promises. The same with law enforcement. They were a little bit wary. They had worked with systems advocacy with the DA's office, and so they knew what that looked like, but it's a different animal when you're working with a community-based advocate, because confidentiality and privilege is different. And so how are we going to share information and what that looked like? And how are we going to work together and improve the response out there when we really didn't even have any assets to work with? So coming into this, we were down 2 team members anyway. And so quickly Jerry and I found it was just going to be the 2 of us. And we had a lot of work to do, and we had a lot of planning and a lot of communication that needed to occur to kind of overcome some of those initial barriers of just that historical law enforcement advocacy relationship, where we're kind of a little bit weary of each other. So I kind of let Jerry speak on that, because I think just coming into the room the first time, that was the initial barrier that we had to overcome.
Yeah, I agree. There was some tiptoeing around and walking on eggshells there for a little bit. And I will say, from the law enforcement perspective, what I found quickly in this process is that if I was going to make if I was going to make this work, if I was going to provide services and a quality service to our survivors, then I needed to not be afraid to look in the mirror and see, where are we falling short? Where are we failing our survivors? If we're going back to the same houses every day, going in, then where are we falling short first? And where can we do better? And then I'll move out from there. And this process really helped me do that. Now, that's why I say it's very important for especially smaller agencies to get your chain of command on board with this process, because a lot of chiefs and administrators are not very good at looking in the mirror. They don't want to touch it, and it is a large process when you're revamping your policies and procedures, and it's time consuming. So make sure that you're discussing this with them, and that you're in it for the right reasons. And just my opinion of it was that as long as on the back end of it, I'm doing what I know that we can do, the very best job that we can do for our survivors for the right reason, then I'm willing to look in the mirror all day long, and we'll make the changes we need to make. And that's what we did. Now, so I was somewhat open to the process when I first began, when Misty's group came on, although I will tell you just what she said, that history and my personal relationships or experiences, I was a little timid with the process and a little untrusting of bringing an advocate into my building and having just access to information and being able to call us out when we're falling short. And Misty is one that has no problem calling you out. And thank God for her for that, because I don't know that we'd be this far along in the process had she not held me to the task of getting it done. And she continues to do that, because it's a learning process, and we're still building as we go. But one of the first things we looked at were reports, and I pulled random domestic violence reports from over the last, I think the last 3 or so years. And we went through those and saw in every one of them, there were mistakes or shortcomings that we could have done better. And we can always armchair quarterback something. But these were, in my opinion, major shortcomings in documentation and proper follow-up, things that we needed to improve on. With that, we revamped our report writing process, and our domestic violence report completely redid it, where we're asking lethality questions now and where we weren't before, and document more on the strangulation side of things, and it's, you know, the ICCR group and Misty's group really helped out a lot with that. And through that process, we built a good working relationship. The trust come along. We started working with some of the victims with Misty's group and saw the return on that. To the point to where, you know, I offered Misty's group an office here within our police department. And I don't have an agency funded victims coordinator or victim services person. And so Aware Central Texas stepped in and filled that role for me. And have an office 2 doors down from mine now, and it's been working out pretty good. Let me see here.
And for those of you, and I'm looking in the chat box, and I'm seeing a lot of law enforcement, a lot of directors at domestic violence, sexual assault centers. For us to co-locate with law enforcement was significant, and most of you would probably agree that's almost unheard of. And so I don't think Jerry is taking enough credit for what he did. He really took a chance. And when you talk about building trust and talking about how we're going to do what's right and what's and provide these services for survivors and make it accessible, he took a chance and allowed a community-based advocacy center to office out of his PD. And that is almost unheard of. And so I don't think he takes enough credit for that, but that was significant to me. And to me, and that was really the point where I knew that he was invested. For someone to take that chance and allow us to have that space and to work out of the police department, I knew the investment was there, and I think that's really that program.
Well,
and I think
I appreciate that.
everybody
Misty,
is
Misty,
proven.
Misty, just so you know, your volume's kind of cutting in and out. I said, so, you know, there was a big investment on my part to invite somebody from the outside into my building here, especially being a fairly new chief here. And I got a lot of raised eyebrows from my employees and others who didn't understand it. My issues were with the systems-based advocacy that we had, or victims coordinator at the VA's office. Any services that that they offered our victims required our victims to travel out of county to a neighboring county or several counties over to obtain those services. Any kind of counseling, they had to go in person. Nobody was coming here. And as we know, a lot of times our victims don't have transportation. I know that. They don't have the resources. They don't have the child care where they can leave a kid with somebody else while they go and try to seek help.
Jerry,
Yes.
we have a question in the chat box or in the Q&A. Are there any policies or procedures to handle a situation if a law enforcement or justice system member is an abuser or an offender themselves?
Yes, my agency has a policy on that. Yes, now I can't speak for law enforcement in general. That would be a departmental issue. Is the question specifically for my agency?
I think it's probably just in general, but if there is one specifically for your agency and you can share a little bit on that, that would be great. And we also have a second question in the chat box.
Right. So throughout my career, I've been around, not directly involved in, but been around and heard of fellow officers who were involved in domestic violence situations at home with their spouses. And back in the day, that was really kind of dealt with kind of like a good old boy system for the most part. I believe the one or two that I know of were not, I say severe. That's such a silly thing to say, but there was some domestic violence there. It was on the lighter side of it, but it was domestic violence nonetheless. And so those cases were kind of treated with, well, we don't want to ruin the guy's career, so don't do it again, slap on the wrist type deal. Speaking personally in my agency, I don't stand for it at all. I've worked these cases too long. I know where to lead, and we can't have it, especially in law enforcement. And so my internal policy that I created here was that if my officers were involved in something like that, once it comes to our attention, that officer is immediately placed on administrative leave until an internal investigation and a criminal investigation can be concluded. I can't necessarily terminate somebody unless it's something we respond to and we see something, my officers see there were signs of violence right then that would most definitely lead to termination. But on the initial part of it, the officers are immediately removed from duty. Their weapons are taken from them and they're placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal and criminal investigation. We would handle our victim services now and the procedures that we have the same way we would with any other victim. The policy also includes that if it is an arrestable offense and there's signs of violence there, that officer is arrested. I mean, the same as it would be anybody else. I don't hold my officers or my employees in any higher regard in regards to domestic violence than I would anybody else. They're held to the same standard, if not, a bit higher. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. We also have a question in the chat. Chief Meadors, if you hadn't sought out these support/resources yourself, what could an advocate say to you to demonstrate the importance and gain support from you to try new strategies?
Oh, Jillian, that's a great question. It's a hard question to answer. With me, obviously it was something I was seeking out. So with me, it wouldn't have took that much. With other law enforcement that I've worked with, that's a hard question to answer. Cops are just like anybody else. Everybody has their niche and something they're more interested in takes priority in their mind and their goals. And for an administrator not to have this as a priority, that would be a tough wall to get through with them. Because like I said, law enforcement is a very closed, tight-knit family. We don't let outsiders in very often. I would think I would, if I were approaching that situation, I would have to just really stay on the reasons that you want to do it is for the victims, is for their quality of life. The people that we serve as law enforcement, is their quality of life. We're here to serve them, not just to show up and arrest people and put them in jail. Our service goes beyond that, to try to make sure that they don't face that same situation every night, every day, that their children aren't brought up in that situation. And it's an endless cycle, something learned behavior. And I would really just word your argument or your stance on that, around that, the service of the victims. And if we can provide resources to these victims and options, it's all about the options. And if we can provide them with options and a light that they can see at the end of their dark tunnel, there's a way out. Then maybe, and it may not happen immediately. We all know that. It may take 4, 5, 6, 12 times before a victim's finally, or survivors finally had enough. And they say, I can't do this anymore. Anything's better than this. And they take their hand and they get out of that situation. But if you're speaking to a police administrator, that's the way I would go at it, really. And just, the more options we can give these victims to get out of that situation, the less likely it is that law enforcement continues to go back to that same residence for that same call. The less likely that our officers are having to engage in use of force incidents in making an arrest. The less likely that we're going to have to go work a homicide at that location someday. or the death of a child, God forbid, or that's just the way I would word that argument, I believe.
Thank you for that answer.
Yes,
And the person who asked the question, thank you. She said, thank you for your insight. And then in the Q&A, we've got a question from Nancy. Given the established relationship between animal abuse, DV, and child abuse, have you found the DV cases you encounter occasionally involve animal abuse as well? And have there been cases where the perpetrator was charged with animal abuse when the DV charges weren't pressed? She's concerned for pets often keeping survivors in dangerous situations.
Right. So, I personally have not been involved or investigated any cases where those two things were hand in hand. I'm certain that they're out there. I have seen a case since I've been here, actually, in which there's a residence that we continue to go back to over and over again, domestic violence, the very lower socioeconomic family, very poor, and which doesn't really have a whole lot to do with it, but just painting a picture here. And we were called over there with one of the children who has probably about 10 years old, has raised up in this environment, and we found them abusing an animal in the backyard. And that child was referred to some psychiatric services and some counseling. I think, honestly, well, my personal opinion is that he was acting out because of what he grew up in and the environment that they were in. But I have not seen a case where the actor is abusing the family's pets and using it in conjunction with the domestic violence. No, I have not seen that.
Okay, awesome. And then the next question we have is actually for Misty. Misty, I know you've been having a couple of tech troubles, so just let us know if something happens. Misty, do the CCRs with which you are involved include animal control, humane law enforcement, or veterinarians?
No, we have not had the ability to have any of the above involved in any of our task force, but that is a really great suggestion and something that I need to work on getting those individuals to the table. Can you hear?
Yes. And I'll follow up on my answer as well. That's a really good question. And although I've not seen it, I've not thought about it either. So I do appreciate the question, and maybe that's something we kind of start paying attention to more, because maybe it is prevalent, and we just didn't think to ask it, and the victim didn't think to speak on it. So that's a very good question. I appreciate that question. Thank you.
And we've got another question in the chat box. So we have someone joining us from the Netherlands, and over there they have a more systemic approach towards domestic violence. It means not only the victim receives support, but also the offender. Is that something that y'all offer?
So actually, our agency does provide services to offenders that are completely separate from the program we do for survivors. We provide violence intervention classes. We are in the process of standing up BIP in the community. But my background in community corrections, I've seen the need for that. One of the things that in my experience and my observations working with offenders, one of the ways that we could assist in maybe making some cognitive change, keeping survivors a little bit safer, was to offer those programs in the community.
Awesome, thank you. And Nancy also said if you guys ever wanted to reach out for resources as far as violence against animals, that she's a good contact. So Nancy, if you just want to put your email in the chat, I can save that for our presenters.
Let's do.
Thank you, Nancy.
And Jillian, I see your comment on there. You can't ask too many questions. That's what this is all about. It's us to try to be a resource to you. And as you can see already, y'all have been a resource to us as well. So now keep asking.
So we have a comment from Victoria. She said, thank you to everyone for your much needed efforts. IPV can be a vulnerability marker for other exploitative individuals. IP stalking can trigger group stalking and targeting, which is increasing in frequency, intensity, and durations in suburbs and rural areas.
Thank you, Victoria.
It looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment, so I will hand it back over to y'all.
So I'm a little bit behind. We had some technical difficulties. We get some rain in Bell County and I lose my internet. So Jerry, I'm gonna have to lean on you a little bit.
Okay, that's fine. Trying to see where I left off here. And so in general, in law enforcement, just for my law enforcement partners in the group will probably recognize this. But for my advocates in the group, just so y'all are aware, historically speaking, law enforcement, especially in larger areas, you go as a patrol officer, you go from call to call to call. And excuse me, my radio is blaring in my ear. Especially in a rural community where we don't have specialized units. Our patrol officer oftentimes is the person who's responsible to follow up on the call that they went to. There's any follow-up investigations. In the larger agencies I worked for, it was great. We had specialized units. That's all they did day in, day out. An officer would go take the initial report, probably call a detective to the scene if it reached that level, hand it over, and they go on to the next call and never see it again. And then there's follow-up done with that. That's good. It's good and bad. But for us here in Rockdale, what I'm finding here, my officers, basically you catch them, you clean them, which can be an issue when you're slammed with calls every day. And law enforcement as a whole, we have a culture of, you go to the call, you make an arrest, you clear the call as fast as we can, you write your report as fast as you can, and you're on to the next call because you're going to be back at this residence again tomorrow. What is the point? They're never going to leave this guy. We're just going to run through the paces real quick and go about our business because we're going to be back here again tomorrow. And then we have a history of sometimes going to repeated residence, sometimes in the same night, where you may not have an arrestable offense, but you keep getting called back by a neighbor because there was a disturbance, they're out there screaming at each other or whatever, and you don't have really an avenue to make an arrest. There's no offense there. But we end up threatening the family in a whole and just say, man, if I got to come back here one more time, in the whole, and just say, man, if I got to come back here one more time, just say, man, his mic is hot. We tend to say, if we got to come back here one more time, somebody's going to jail for something because we're tired of coming back here. And I'm guilty of saying that myself. I've been there. And what I didn't know, what I didn't realize there at the time is a lot of times it really puts up a barrier between us and the survivor. And they hear that and they don't want to go to jail. You're getting called there for help. And to say, if I got to come back one more time, I'm going to arrest somebody, it could be them. But they don't want to go to jail. They don't want their kids to be with that actor while they're sitting in jail for something. And so I think we've all seen how much a survivor will put up with to make sure that their children are safe in their mind. And so that may prevent them from calling us for assistance in the future. So we kind of, in law enforcement as a whole, kind of out of survival, I guess, but we've kind of put up some of those barriers ourselves. Our actual role in law enforcement, in my opinion, through my experience, is not only to stop the initial violence when we respond to the scene, but also to build that trusting relationship with survivors through our actions. When we go there, not rushing through the interview process, listening and actually hearing what the victims, the survivors, and the other survivors in the house are telling us, understanding the dynamic of their situation. And okay, we may have an assault here today that we're investigating right now, but what led up to this? What is your history with this individual? How many times has this happened before? Or has it just been escalating over time with verbal, or just the way the perpetrator is isolating those individuals from the rest of the family members and friends and co-workers and things like that? And all of that's so important in the documentation process that even though those past times we've been at residence, there was no offense, nothing to report. If we take that time and actually hear the victim and listen to their story and their histories, and we can add that into our documentation and paint a picture for a prosecutor and a potential future jury to understand this was an escalating situation. It didn't just happen today. Things weren't just, rainbows and ponies up until the moment this guy just snapped and decided to punch this woman in the face. 9 times out of 10, this has been building for weeks, months, or years. And so the better we can do at our job at documenting that, the better off everybody's going to be. The more likely it is to get a good conviction on this person, or maybe the prosecutor doesn't feel like he needs to offer a plea deal on this case. We can take this to trial because we're comfortable. We've painted enough, a clear enough picture of this predator that the community sitting on that jury will say, we don't want him out here. We don't want him interacting with our families, and we don't want to see this victim go through this anymore. Maybe this guy gets some time. Spending more time listening and understanding the overall dynamic, providing the survivor with information, and I say this a million times, options, giving them some options, assuring them that we will always come back. Not if I have to come back, I'm going to go arrest you. No, it's pulling that person aside, whispering, slipping something to them, saying, I will always be here for you. I will come every time you call me. And I don't care if it's 100 times. Maybe that 99th time that we go, we save that person's life. And it's so worth it. It is so worth it.
Jared, we've
yes.
got a few more questions actually. From what you've seen, what is the most important financial assistance you've seen for survivors? Is it rental assistance, hotel funding for safe shelter, groceries, utilities, cell phones, legal fees, counseling, medical bills, moving assistance? I'm curious if there's been something that you've consistently seen that's come up that you've thought, wow, I wish we had money to meet that need.
For sure. Misty, can I hit this first?
All of the above.
All of the above.
And I think that for each survivor, it's different. And we only have a limited amount of funds. That's just the nature of nonprofit work and surviving off grants, but all of the above. Housing is a significant issue in our area. The wait list for any kind of housing assistance is up to a year. Being able to get them into a hotel or shelter is difficult. Shelter beds are few and far between. So, like I said, all of the above.
Yes, I agree. For us responding officers on the scene, if I have a victim that's actually willing to leave that situation, and it may be a situation where I can't make an arrest, but man, we know once I leave this house, something has the potential of really happening here. And if I can convince that survivor to leave the residence, where does she have to go? In previous organizations I worked with, we had budgets for that. We had victim services and things like that. We can call up, get a hotel room somewhere away where the suspect doesn't know where they are, and just give them a few hours of peace and sleep to clear their mind and weigh their options means so much. And not to be here in a rural setting where I don't have those resources. And I have a victim who's willing to leave right now and get out of that situation, but I have no way of getting her there and no way of funding it. It's pretty, it's tough. I've seen my own officers pay out of their pocket, and I have as well, and bought hotel rooms, and my officers don't make very much money, but they understand the importance of it. And so that to me is a big deal, having funds available or resources available to if I physically got to relocate this family right now, can I do it or not? And so to have that resource in your back pocket at a phone call away, like Aware Central Texas does for us, is just immeasurable. It me as a chief, it gives me peace of mind that we do have at least that option. But other than that, I would say yes, all the above.
And we're really lucky. As an organization, we do receive VOCA funding. We do have money to provide emergency hotels, to provide Ubers for our survivors. We do have some financial resources that we're able to push out into the community. So we're an agency that is really lucky. There's a lot of agencies that don't have those resources like we do. The tricky thing is when you get into a city the size of Rockdale, that's about 5,000 people, you don't have the assets in that area to even sometimes utilize the funds that you have. Trying to keep a survivor safe in a city where everyone knows everyone is kind of difficult. So we're trying to move them to the next city over. And not only that, there's no public transportation. Ubers are not available. So there's some difficulty even trying to spend some of our funds when we get into these rural areas.
Thank you, guys. So our next question is, I see a lot of kids and families that refuse to go to the police because of their perception of how law enforcement will respond and the negatives they have seen in their personal lives or in the news. What can I say to them?
So this is something that Jerry and I have worked really hard to try to bridge some gaps in the community and to try to build trust with law enforcement. And so what we've done is try to get into the community and do some fun events where law enforcement has the ability to interact with community members, with kids, to let them know that they are there, that they can seek help, that they're, and kind of establish some trust. And I'll let Jerry speak on that too. But that was very important to me in the very beginning because there was some distrust. There was distrust that the system wasn't going to help them. And so that was one of the initial barriers that we really had to look at too, is how do we build trust with the community?
Yes, I agree. So it's always been a big thing with me throughout my career, but when I moved to this community, there was some distrust between the community and law enforcement. There was a disconnect for sure. Law enforcement here, it was under the mindset that we're going to come when you call and we're going to put somebody in jail. And then the personal side of that was just absent. Interaction with the community was on, we're here to enforce the law and arrest somebody. And so, what Misty and I really started doing since day one really was basically just community policing, which I always kind of laugh at that phrase, community policing, like it's some new concept. But community policing is just what policing always should have been. There's nothing new. We are here to serve our community. We are here because the community allows us to be here. And so to go out and interact with them on a personal level that's not on an official level means so much and allows them to see, yeah, we're human, and allows us to see that they're human. It's not an us versus them, it's us for them. And so that is my philosophy on that, always has been and always will be. And we've seen the difference in that. I've seen now where if we're driving through town, especially during the summer, and we have children walking around town all the time. It's a very small community, and kids walk across town to go to the park by themselves. And they'll wave us down, and they're not afraid to wave us down and say hi and ask us to come over there and talk to them, or ask me for a ride to the park because it's 103 degrees outside, and what are we going to do? Well, I'm not on a call. I'll give them a ride to the park. I'm okay with that. So just, being human, and we've seen it make a difference so far, and we're not done with that yet. We were just getting started on that here.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Our next question is, in rural communities where everyone knows everyone, does the good old boy concept affect the enforcement of domestic violence protective orders and trespassing orders filed by victims? If so, how is that issue addressed?
So I think from the very beginning, that was a conversation that Jerry and I had. I grew up in a rural Texas community. I'm from the panhandle of Texas. And that was a concern. And so when we talk about the candid conversations that Jerry and I had in the very beginning, that was one of the questions I asked him is, has this been the model? Is this how things are enforced? How are things enforced? And we had some very candid conversations about that. And I can tell you that is not the way that Jerry has, the way their policies and procedures work, that is not their policy there. And I'll let Jerry again speak on that too. But there was a lot of candid conversation.
Yes, there was. And so, I don't want to bash on my own agency. This is a good town. It's a good agency. They were very behind in the way they did things here.
Jerry, it looks like you're back. You cut out for a second, but you're back.
Yeah, we got struck by lightning and I guess our generator kicked in, thank goodness. Sorry about that. So what I was saying is, yeah, when I first got here, I wouldn't say it was necessarily all out good old boy system, but man, it was close. And depending on who you were, maybe not so much would be done. Maybe we would just, hey, y'all don't do that again and go on about our business. I do not subscribe to doing business that way. The law is the law and it's that way for a reason. And I believe in protecting our victims. And so when I first came in, I put my foot down on it and I reviewed our policies and I hold my guys and my employees accountable to that. I'm not from this town. I don't have family in this town. I don't know you and I don't owe you. What I owe the community is for me to do my job the way the law tells me I should. And so, no, we don't have the good old boy system here. It could be the mayor. It could be me. Anybody. We violate that Family Violence Act. We're going to be dealt with according to the law here. That's plain simple. And that is what it is. Now, I will tell you that I had many employees that were here when I first started that I told that to, and they didn't believe me. And I told them, if you're doing business the way you used to, you won't be doing it here anymore. And they're not here anymore. And so that's how I dealt with that internally. The people who got on board and want to do things the right way, they're still here with me, and those who aren't or didn't or not, and they can go do something somewhere else. But they're not doing it here. So to answer your question, no, we don't have it here, and I won't have it here.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, if it did exist in Rockdale or in some other communities, how would you go about challenging the good old boy perception? This is a question for both of you.
Right. I think honestly, just by the way I did it, the public has their perception of how the agencies run, and over the past, like I said, the bit of distrust that we've had with the community here, I think quite a bit of it was earned just by the way the department ran its business. And myself getting out, speaking with the community and allowing people access to me and my philosophy over law enforcement, the way we conduct business. They saw what my view on it was and different topics, whether it be domestic violence or narcotics or anything. And then to see me enforce that, I think builds that trust with the community. They know I wouldn't blow in smoke. And I can't, the way I dealt with it is as I don't tolerate it. And I let my agency know we're not gonna tolerate it. And then I didn't. And I stood by that, and I'll continue to stand by that. So.
And to add to that too, it's been open communication, because if a survivor communicates to us, Jerry has always sat and listened to any concerns or anything that a survivor might have to say about the way the policing is being conducted, what their interactions were like with law enforcement. So again, it goes back to communication. We're talking. And we don't go into it with kind of at that, it's not adversarial. It's just open communication.
Sure.
And that's something that's absolutely necessary in all of this. You can't sit on it. You have to talk about it.
And perception is just that somebody on the outside or a citizen may perceive that we do things a certain way, and so there's a distrust there. And so I do invite that open communication with the public if they have concerns or complaints about my officers. And believe me, man, I'm a player's coach, and I will back my men and women 100% if they're in the right. But I will not sweep anything under the rug when we make a mistake. We're going to own it, and we're going to correct it, and we're going to learn from it, move on. And so I invite the community's comments to that. There's a plaque in my lobby that says, for any kind of complaints or questions or concerns or anything, here's an email, here's a phone number, knock on my door. I'm going to hear it. Now, a lot of this is false perception. And they'll come in or they'll write me a letter, an email or something, and I think this is going on. Or why do y'all do things a certain way? And your initial in law enforcement, I would guess probably the same with any profession, is that when someone's questioning you, your initial is, man, what business is of yours? But if you shake that off and shake off your pride a little bit and understand, they're trying to understand, they're asking the question, why do you do business this way? And so that, not being afraid to open up that dialogue and answer the question, well, this is why we're doing it this way. And a lot of times I've found that has helped me out quite a bit and changed some perception of some of the members of my community who at first were not for us at all. But have changed their view of my agency since then. And they know I'm going to answer them as honestly as I can. Now, there may be some things I can't talk about, and I explain that, but I don't mind explaining it to them. And sometimes they want to feel like they're being heard and understood, just like anybody else. So yeah, we do that as much as we can.
Awesome, thank you. And we've got quite a few more questions. So next up is, as an advocate, I hear stories of inappropriate responses by law enforcement. How much is vicarious trauma and burnout addressed from a self-care standpoint? This may prevent them from calling in the future and manifesting the safety concerns.
Okay, I'm assuming the self-care and burnout on behalf of law enforcement.
Yes.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, is that improper response from law enforcement due to burnout or vicarious trauma from dealing with these calls over and over again, and maybe we're just tired of it, so we're not treating each call the way we should. Is that, am I getting?
Yeah, that's how I'm reading it.
Okay. So this is a big one here. Law enforcement in as a whole is horrible about taking care of ourselves. We're horrible at it. And it's not that much different from the military in that aspect. Whereas the military over the recent 20 years or so has come a good way of finally recognizing, okay, if you send somebody out on the war zone and they're on the front lines every day for a year and a half, 2 years, extended deployments, when you come back, they're not necessarily the same person they were when they left. And we're seeing the cases of that in our soldiers coming home. They're having trouble, PTSD type symptoms, anger issues, and understandably so. But finally, as a nation, we're starting to address that. We are so far away from where we should be, but at least the conversation is being had now, and I see that as improvement. As law enforcement, we'll send our officers to these calls every day for 27, 30 years. And you suck it up and you go to the next call, because the stigma of asking somebody for help in this career is career ending in some cases. To say that I'm struggling with something, or I don't feel good, or I'm having problems with this, you don't do it, period. Because if you ask for psychiatric help or any kind of therapy or counseling session, you're put on light duty, you're ostracized, you're weak, and you can't handle your job, which is such BS. We're no different than anybody else, and we are exposed to trauma over and over and over again, sometimes multiple times a day with different calls. I've gone from personally from several death calls to a child abuse call, and then back to a suicide of a 10-year-old, all in one shift. And that's a lot to take in. And then you just suck it up, and now you're going to go over here and take a barking dog complaint, and you're expected to be okay. So my long-winded answer to your question is, law enforcement as a whole does not address this issue yet the way we should. But I have seen over the last 5 or so years where law enforcement, there's now a trend, and we're starting to trend towards understanding, hey, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to ask for help. If this one call bothers you, say something to somebody. We have peer support groups now that are being generated within law enforcement. Now, this is not within every agency, and there's no state mandate for it, which I think is almost a crime in itself. I think it should be. Having experienced this many times myself over a 26 plus year career, and now being in the position that I'm in, I'm very proactive at it. I provide my officers with paid peer support and paid therapy sessions with a person who is trained in and trauma. And all she deals with is law enforcement and military personnel who have undergone trauma or experienced traumatic or critical incidents. I have a very, very large policy on that, and is very open to any of my officers and or dispatchers, civilian employees who are experiencing issues or just not feeling quite right about that last call, to get it off their chest. They're not ostracized here. They're encouraged to speak on it and get it out in the open. I'm very proactive at that. And because it could save a career. It could save a life, honestly. And so I see that a lot. Not only in our response to domestic violence calls, but our calls in general and dealing with the public in general, that this stress builds up, it's cumulative, and it builds up over time. And all of a sudden, and we've all seen the videos on TV, unfortunately, over the last few years, where an officer will just snap on somebody for no reason. Like, man, what a jerk. You know, that guy must have had a long career of being a bad apple or something. And maybe not. He could have been a model officer up until the moment where he just couldn't take it anymore. And for whatever reason, he snapped. That doesn't make it okay. But I think we as law enforcement failed that officer years ago, and we failed the public by not dealing with it years ago. So I'm hoping that we're getting there, is my answer to your question. I'm hoping that we're getting there. We're a long way from where we need to be. I think more administrators and law enforcement need to be more proactive and take a look at this, because I think we're going to find not only is law enforcement suicide, oh goodness, right now it's probably the leading cause of death among law enforcement nationwide. And I truly believe that's a direct result from years of vicarious trauma, if not direct trauma. I think a lot more administrators need to be proactive in that and addressing that. And I think once as a whole, that law enforcement starts doing that and treating it honestly, I think we'll see a decrease in the numbers of excessive force calls in cases and the way we treat the public. I think there's a direct correlation to that. So, long-winded answer, and I hope I answered you. So.
Thank you. Next question is, staying in a domestic violence situation means children are being abused. How do you go about that? And at what point do you involve children's services?
Oh.
That's funny. We were just discussing this the other day and having some arguments over this.
So I disagree with his policy. We've agreed to disagree on this policy. I understand the need for the policy and involving child protective services. As advocates, we look at how a survivor is being a protective parent a little bit different than how law enforcement has typically looked at that in the past. And so, yeah, we've had a lot of conversation about this, and it is the policy of a lot of the departments that we work with, that if they are called out and children are present during the assault, that they are going to involve child protective services.
Yes, and that is our policy. My officers go to a domestic violence call and there is violence there, and that child was present. Then we automatically call child protective services, is what we have in Texas. We make a referral over a law enforcement hotline. Now, if the child themselves are victims of an assault that day or injured, we go a whole separate direction of that, but CPS is always involved in that, referred. But if they're just a witness to it, we still refer to CPS for a follow-up, because we understand that cycle, that child's witnessing this, and in law enforcement, we kind of prioritize who's most important every time we go to a call. And so for us, a child safety would be priority one over anybody else in the household. And then next would be the adult victim, and so on and so forth. So we tend to prioritize our most vulnerable first, and we try to go above and beyond to make sure that person is protected. Now, with that being said, even though we do that, I don't disagree with Misty's opinion of that and the problems that can cause in the family dynamic immediately and for weeks and months, years to come. There is a cost to be paid for involving child protective services on these calls. I understand her position.
Sorry.
No.
We see the survivor take the brunt of most of the responsibility once CPS is involved. The survivor is asked to attend parenting classes. They're mandated to obtain a protective order. And for those of us that have been in advocacy long enough, we know that they have no decision whether or not they are going to obtain a protective order. That is up to the court. And so there is a lot of responsibility that's put on the survivor once CPS enters into the situation, and the perpetrator is really not held accountable by CPS as much as they, in most cases, the mother.
That is true. That is very true. But you know, here in Texas, our hands are kind of, for police officers, our hands are kind of tied on this deal. And if we didn't make the referral, and if something ends up happening later on that night, or when a guy gets out of jail and we never referred it, we end up bearing the brunt of that. And so it's just a kind of a CYA and a catch-all for the child and the agency that we go ahead and make that referral and let the pieces fall where they fall.
But that's good report writing too. And one of the things that we've had a lot of discussion about is what can the officers articulate in their report that is going to be beneficial, even if they have to make that call to CPS. What is going to be articulated in that report that is going to actually work in that the survivor's favor.
Right. Right.
Thank you, guys. Our next question is, how can you work with law enforcement when they have their preference, explicit biases of working with system-based advocates over community-based advocates?
Okay, that's difficult. So we come to the table and we work with everyone. Part of what we have to do is try to build a relationship, and a lot of what we have to do initially is change mindsets. I think we are really lucky. Part of it being that I was kind of embedded in the law enforcement community here when I took over this agency. So I didn't experience a lot of that bias because the law enforcement community knew me, and they knew how I provided advocacy and how I did business. It is, I think, the biggest thing that we have to overcome, and one of the most difficult things when we work with law enforcement, is the confidentiality aspect, and trying to explain to them and kind of get them to understand that we're not being difficult to work with. We're protecting the confidentiality of our client, and it's not that we're trying to put a barrier in place, but it is imperative that we protect that confidentiality. So how do I work with them? How do we work with them as an agency? We just keep coming back to the table. We're trying to do the best job we can. We're trying to train. We're trying to educate them on what we do, and hopefully that changes a little bit of the mindset.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Next question. Did you do any training for your dispatchers, or were they involved in the process of trying to improve response?
So we're looking at doing training with the dispatchers, and actually one of our advocates is a former dispatcher from Bell County. So what we're hoping to do in the next, hopefully in the next year, is be able to provide some of that training and utilize our advocates' experience to be able to work with the dispatchers too.
Yes, in the policy that I rolled out, my internal policy on response to domestic violence calls, does have a spot, a section in there addressing dispatch, improving on, the information gathered on the front end of the call before an officer is even dispatched to the call, the questions asked, things like that we can use, that's all on a recorded line, whether it be on 911 or just a landline when they call in, things that we can use as evidence in court later on, answering those questions, whereas by the time my officers get there and they're asking these questions, and maybe the victim doesn't want to talk as much anymore, things like that. So there will be training coming out. It hasn't happened just yet, but they will be incorporated in that, because it's a holistic approach to dealing with this from every aspect of my agency. So yes, there's the answer to that question.
Awesome, thank you. All right. How much of getting everyone on board with this new approach was a collaborative effort to address the concerns of the law enforcement versus how much was a directive directly from you as the supervisor? Did you roll out the new policy and say, this is how it is, this is your job? Or was it more of a buy-in, or was it more of creating buy-in among your team?
Right.
We all came together when he rolled out the policy,
Yeah.
all of the same room. Let you jump in there.
Yes. So as far as me developing the policy, I asked, I've always had the opinion none of us are as smart as all of us. Okay. And so us being the ICCR group that I was with Misty and then the other ICCR persons involved, I presented them my current policy and asked for their input and the advocates' input. And where do you think that we can improve on this? What questions can we ask better? Where do we fall short? And I took their suggestions and I reviewed them. Now, I didn't agree with all of them. And there's some things, for whatever reason, just because of my experience, I know doesn't work in the law enforcement world. But the vast majority of them were good suggestions. And I tailored that to meet our situation. But I wasn't afraid to ask for the help and the input. And that's so important for my law enforcement people on here that to say, man, put your pride aside. If you're going to look at your policies and procedures, put it to the side and look in the mirror. Don't be afraid, because you're only going to come out better on the other side of it. I promise you. It's not going to hurt. And that's what I had to do. So I invited them in, look at my policies, my procedures. Where do I fall short, and where can we improve? As far as the buy-in from my personnel, it was a department-wide meeting. It was a mandatory meeting, and this is why we're here. And this is what we're going to do from now on. Now, I invited Misty's group to come in when I did that policy rollout, and we went over the policy word for word, literally. And we explained with them and trained them at the same moment, I believe, with the advocacy group being here, explaining this is the new policy, this is why we're doing this, this is the desired result of doing it this way. Now, with that, we got buy-in from all of my officers, and they know me enough by now. They know if I'm rolling something out, I mean it. And so they understand that, and they were all attentive, and they understood, and they were allowed to ask questions. Well, why are we doing this? Why that? Why this extra paperwork? And we were able to answer that. And I think that's really important, not just because I said so. That never works for anybody. And so you need the buy-in. You need them to understand it and believe in it to get them to do it naturally when they go to these calls, and understand what the benefit of doing this is. So yeah, it was a collaborative effort from start to finish, and I think it worked well.
And a follow-up question to that, what is the policy and what is the policy, and if when law enforcement is called out for a DV call, do they dispatch advocates right away, or is it more of a warm referral after the call is complete? And are advocates in the room during interviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on the call. And so if there's a situation where
If it necessitates an advocate being on scene, we're going to make it happen.
yes.
Typically, what we have the officer do is call us on scene. They're not just leaving a card and saying, hey, call these people, they're going to help you. They're picking up the phone and they're calling us while they're there.
Yes.
That's significant.
Yes. And so if there's a situation where it's a verbal or whatever, we'll make a referral with a card. Hey, this wasn't violent now. You say there's no history of violence. It could very much go that way. So we give a little bit of counseling and officer to survivor there. If this continues to happen, here's some help. Here's somebody you can call. They can give you options and, counseling, things like that. If it requires something where the advocate needs to be on scene, yeah, we pick up the phone, we call Misty's group, and they're there. Now, it may take an hour or so to get there, but they're coming. And that's the best response that we can get in our situation here. But like Misty said, 9 times out of 10, we get there and there's surveillance on the scene, and we don't just give them a card and say, call these people and walk away from it. We get the advocacy group on the phone right then, and we hand the phone directly to the survivor, and we put her in touch, that individual in touch with options right then. We don't wait. That was the whole goal of beginning this process to begin with, is to provide that victim, that survivor, with options immediately, not 2 weeks from now, not whenever they worked at the courage to pick up the phone and feel like they betrayed their entire family by asking for help. We put them on the phone right then and provide them as many options as soon as possible.
Awesome, thank you. Next question. Do you speak to other police departments about this collaborative work that the two of you are doing?
Yes, I do. So I am the only agency in my county that has done this. The other agencies, we've held quarterly training throughout the year-long process of the ICCR process. We held quarterly trainings, and I've sent out invites. And we've got a decent response from all the surrounding law enforcement agencies have attended these trainings. They know that we're working on this. I've spoken with the department heads of those agencies and have invited them to review my new policies. But I kind of fall back on the history of law enforcement, where we are very, this is mine, and I'm not ready to let anybody else inside, including fellow law enforcement, come in and critique anything that I've got going on. If it's not broke, we don't want to fix it, sort of thing. And so that change is slow to come. I think over time, when we start seeing a reduction in calls to repeat locations and things like that, when I can pull those stats in a year or so and be able to show my fellow law enforcement heads, hey, this is the result from it, and it's making a difference. And then I think we'll have a little bit more buy-in from them at that point. But yes, I continue to reach out to my fellow law enforcement agencies. I try to be a resource for them as well. We're very small, like I said, we're a very small rural county, and so we do have to depend on each other, and communication is important. But yes, I'm trying my best to let this spread as much as possible, but it's slow to spread. Honestly, I'll tell you, it is very slow to spread.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So what more could be expected from religious communities in helping to bridge the gap?
I think that the faith-based community has always been an ally in this work, especially in rural communities, because really the faith-based community is usually the only option a lot of rural communities have to provide resources or any kind of assistance. And so from the very beginning of this process, the faith-based community was invited to the table and readily came to the table in order to offer assistance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree 100%. They could be very instrumental in this process. I've not had a bad experience with them yet. But they can be very, very helpful, very helpful.
Okay, great. It looks like that was our last question, and we're just at the end of our time. So Misty and Jerry, if there's any couple of last things you'd like to wrap up on.
I would just, I would like to say that I really appreciate all the questions, and I know that we didn't get to all of them. There were some really good questions I saw in there, and I apologize for that. Feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can do to assist you all. I'm really impressed by the diverse group of people that we have joining here from other states and even other countries. I didn't expect that response, so I really appreciate y'all's time and tuning in. I'm hoping maybe if you find yourself in the same situation that I was in law enforcement, that you check out the ICCR group, the program, get your administration involved from the get-go and get them to buy in. It's going to make your job a lot easier. And as law enforcement, man, swallow your pride once in a while. We're here to serve, and you can be that one person that stood out and changed everything. So don't be afraid to do it. Reach out to your advocacy groups and build partners, build relationships, build options for these people that we serve. Your community is going to be so much better off for it, I promise you. And if I can do anything for anybody, please feel free to reach out.
And again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm sorry we had technical difficulties on my side, but if I could leave you with anything is for the advocates, continue to try to communicate with law enforcement agencies. Sometimes it feels like we're hitting a dead end. Keep trying, keep talking. Communication is the key in all of this. For any of this to work, And for us to collaborate, we've got to keep communicating.
Thank you, Misty and Jerry, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Attendees, thank you for joining us. Please watch your email for the webinar evaluation, accreditation certificate, and the recording of today's webinar, which will be sent within 24 hours. And I will also include ways to contact our presenters if you have any more questions. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Jill, can I say one more thing? Jillian, I see your question here for me. Yes, contact me on the information that they're going to share with you, and I'm happy to talk with you on the side.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Everyone have a great afternoon.
You all.